Japan's chief government spokesman, Yoshihide Suga, moved a step closer to becoming the next premier when the ruling party decided on Tuesday on a slimmed-down leadership vote that favors the long-time lieutenant of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Suga has also won the backing of the largest faction of the Liberal Democratic Party, media reported, making him a strong front-runner to replace Abe, who announced on Friday he was stepping down for health reasons. Suga, 71, would be widely expected to stay the policy course set out by Abe, including the Abenomics strategy aimed at reviving the economy and keeping it afloat amid the pandemic. A self-made politician, Suga was chosen by Abe in 2012 for the pivotal role of Chief Cabinet Secretary, acting as a top government spokesman and coordinating policies. Suga's most likely rivals for the top spot will be former Defense Minister Shigeru Ishiba and ex-Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze Japan's search for a new Prime Minister and what it means for India. Joining me on the program today are Vishnu Prakash, former ambassador, Arsmi Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation, and Professor Srikanth Pandapalli, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you first. Let's first analyze everything that's been going on in Japan over the past week. Firstly, current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talking about stepping down because of health reasons. It's not the first time that it's being done. It's happened for the second time. History seems to be repeating itself. What does this mean for Japan?
You are absolutely right. There was speculation about the extent of the health issues of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, but his decision to resign has come as a surprise. He has been a good friend of India. He has been a votary of India-Japan relations. So Prime Minister Modi has also sent out a very good message to him. Now, in terms of Japan, their biggest fear is instability, because Japan has seen a period of revolving door prime ministers. So I think the buzzword is to prevent instability and have continuity, because Japan is facing problems at the moment, including economic issues, the pandemic, issues with China. So that is the buzzword, and I agree with you that Suga-san is the front runner when it comes to the next to a successor of Prime Minister Abe.
Right, Professor Pandapalli, let me bring you to the picture now. So what does all of this mean for India-Japan ties as a whole? Like the ambassador just mentioned, India and Japan have had a very warm and very strong partnership over the last few years with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at the helm of affairs. Do things change now? What does it mean for the larger Indo-Japan partnership?
I think in the last one decade, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had made many of his policies, like the global partnership with India in 21st century, the Indo-Pacific idea, where he has mentioned about rule of law, free and open Indo-Pacific, or other ideas. These have become a part of consensus within the Japanese political system in the parliamentary politics of Japan. So whoever is the successor, he is likely to continue this consensus approach that has emerged. And the approach has been debated for nearly a decade, since 2007, and has been ironed out and has been proposed. For example, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe addressed the Indian Parliament and he mentioned about the arc of prosperity and peace, security. Now, these have become the mainstream ideas within Japan. Not only that, willy-nilly, India has also accepted. At that time, of course, India's position was we need an arc of peace and stability. But today, with the India joining the Quad, the Indo-Pacific idea, and intensifying the India-Japan kind of strategic partnership in the fields of maritime, economic, technological, space, BMD systems, ballistic missile defense systems. In all these 4 areas, this has become a main consensus point. So it appears that these policies will be pursued because there has been a lot of consensus that emerged between the two countries.
All right, then taking the discussion forward, Professor Pant, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. As far as, the top, as far as who could be the successor, as far as Prime Minister Abe is concerned, it seems like Suga is the front runner as of now, but then there are a few others as well who, who seem to be among the candidates who could possibly take over from Shinzo Abe. That is Shigeru Ishiba is one of them, and there's also Fumio Kishida. So, what is the process that is likely to be followed next? How soon can we see a prime minister being a new prime minister coming to the helm? And what is going to be the challenge really as far as the next prime minister of Japan is concerned?
It seems, Frank, that September 15th is the date that they have announced for the leadership elections. And more and more, whatever evidence is coming out, it seems that various factions of the LDP, of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, are coalescing around Mr. Suga. So clearly, there is a shift happening in terms of who will take Mr. Abe's legacy forward, and that's a big question. Mr. Abe leaves behind, as we have been discussing, a very formidable legacy. For a conservative prime minister, he has been able to shake up Japanese domestic economic policy as well as foreign policy in ways that I don't think many of us anticipated when he assumed office. Japan is not known for aggressive posturing on foreign policy or domestic. It's known for gradual incrementalism in its policy evolutions. And so I think Mr. Abe's legacy remains very formidable, and therefore many in his party would be considering who is the best person forward. There is now a greater consensus around Mr. Abe's legacy. There is a consensus around his, economic policy. Though in the recent times, the dividends have not been that sharp, that strong. But on foreign policy, on security policy, there is greater consensus. And I think that aspect where, who will be the best successor to him will be the most important point of contention. And there we have seen two kinds of election maneuvering. One election where the entire rank and file of the LDP votes, and where you only have the parliamentary factions voting. I think what is now happening is that whatever reports are coming out is that we are seeing a more restricted voting happening on Mr. Suga and on the prime ministers, on the next leader, and therefore Mr. Suga has emerged as a very formidable choice. Although if you look at his approval ratings nationally, they are not as good as perhaps for some of the others. So clearly what we are looking at now within the party, an evolution in terms of Mr. Abe's legacy and who will take that legacy forward. And as I said, it's a formidable legacy, not only in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of domestic economic policy. After all, he gave Japan one of its longest expansionistic streak before the crisis hit. And also, I think some of the more interesting stuff, which is not often talked about, like entry of women into the corporate sector, womenomics. It's a for a conservative society like Japan, he has really been able to shake up the demographic profile in terms of who enters the corporate sector and who does not. So I think there is a larger change in Japanese worldview that is happening. And a lot of that has to do with Mr. Abe. And I think for LDP, the question would be who can take that forward, if at all, there is a larger consensus building around Mr. Abe and perhaps what needs to continue beyond Mr. Abe as well.
Absolutely. I'm going to come back to this issue of what does this mean for the LDP and, how much do we know about Suga-san as well in just a bit. But before that, I'm going to go back to a point that I was making earlier and took up with Professor Kondapalli, Ambassador. As far as relationships between India and Japan is concerned, what does all of this mean? Can we see the same kind of cooperation with Japan that we've seen during the Abe era? What is going to be our biggest challenge really as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned?
India-Japan relations have been on a strong upward trajectory since the visit of Mori-san in August 2000. And I think it was in 2006 that we introduced the annual bilateral summits. We have the 2+2 dialogue. Japan is our largest partner in terms of ODA, infrastructure development, on the defense side, on the political side. You name it. The relationship has literally moved from strength to strength under successive prime ministers. And Prime Minister Abe took it quite a few notches further, because and underlying the relationship are two aspects. One is bilateral, because there is a convergence of interests, and the Japanese and Japanese corporate houses are particularly interested in the growing Indian economy, growing Indian market, but also the external factor. And there, Japan and India are two countries which have which perceive an unequivocal threat, security threat from China. And that is one of the reasons which has kind of welded the relationship even closer. So I would see continuity in this relationship because there is a convergence of interests. And now the only question in my mind is whether the successor of Prime Minister Abe will have a similar commitment to the Quad process. And I am more and more, I tend to think that they will, because again, the way China is behaving, it leaves the world with no choice but to come together to send a message out to China that this kind of an aggressive behavior cannot be allowed. And we do need a new Asian security architecture. I think Quad could form a nucleus for that.
Okay, all right. Now, going back to a point, that I was trying to bring out earlier, I'll come to Quad as well in just a bit. Professor Kondapalli, what does this mean for the LDP? What does this change of guard mean for Japan as a whole? And, how much do we know about, Mr. Suga and his policies and the kind of person that he is?
The Liberal Democratic Party, since they were ruling from 1955, they have formalized several factions. And roughly about 7 factions are very important here. And there is a huge discussion, debate, the kind of postings that have to be made, appointments to be made, everything is sorted out in these factions. So essentially, first we will see the kind of shadow boxing that happens in these factions in order to elect their leader. And this is where I think today the press conference to be called by Mr. Suga will reflect to this factional kind of struggle within the LDP. The dominant faction is obviously with Shinzo Abe's faction, which has been in ruling. And of course, this dispersed the posts, the appointments for crucial, parliamentary as well as the ministerial berths, so on and so forth. It is actually very intensive fighting within these LDP factions. Sometimes you also find a consensus candidate emerging. Many times you have the fighting goes on. At that time, a neutral candidate is generally thrown open. Much like, for instance, in India, when I.K. Gujral or Deve Gowda became the prime ministerial candidates because of various pressures that have been brought about within the opposition parties at that point of time. Even within the Congress, for instance, P.V. Narasimha Rao was elected as a consensus candidate. They do see, in many instances, LDP also had such experience. And so we will have to see. And even after forming the government, there is only 1 year roughly for the new leader to consolidate and then go for the polls in 2021. So in this 1 year, obviously he will have to consolidate the positions and then also formulate In this context, the India policy would be a kind of continuity because the new leader would not like to take something radically different, and hence possibly we will see a kind of continuity in this. And since most of the policy as well as institutions that have come about in the India-Japan interactions. For instance, India has the summit level meetings with only Russia and Japan for the last 2 decades. And there is a lot of consensus that has been built up as part of the 2+2 dialogue process between the defense ministry and the foreign ministries. So in the last 2 decades of discussions, many issues have been thrashed out. Of course, the pace has to be increased. For instance, the Ahmedabad to Mumbai high-speed railway, it is taking slightly a slower pace. Likewise, the DMIC, Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which the Japanese want to pace up with nearly $90 billion of funding for this. Nevertheless, we will probably see the new leader continuing these because these are long-term projects. And hence we probably will see the consensus in place and pursuing, because the new leader will have to stand for elections within just 1 year. So he or she will be drawn more into the domestic politics. So that is where the key problem will be in terms of the new leader's prospects.
Okay, all right. Professor Pant, let's go back to this other aspect of Quad, and what does this mean really as far as the Quad framework is concerned. There was recently a meeting, between Australia, India, and Japan that was extremely successful. Going forward, can we see the Quad? And there have been reports coming out of the US as well that the US wants to formalize the Quad very soon and take it up a notch as well. Do we expect this all 4 members to be on the same page going forward?
And I think that is a very, very important point where I think Mr. Abe would be missed initially, at least, because he was able to articulate this much before anyone else did. As Shrikant was mentioning earlier, his speech to the Indian Parliament, on the confluence of the 2 Cs, actually set the agenda for the larger Indo-Pacific vision. And at times, many, even in India, were not buying it. Many in the region were not buying it. But I think his persistence in making that case again and again and articulating it in a manner that was not simply about challenging China, but also about how fundamentally important this idea of connection between the 2 oceans is for countries like Japan and India. That actually ignited this whole conversation, around which today we have an almost immutable consensus. If you look at the region today, Indo-Pacific as a narrative, as a concept, as an idea has been incorporated not simply in the vision documents of traditional countries like Japan or even in India, but even Southeast Asia. You have ASEAN coming out with an Indo-Pacific vision. So clearly the ideas and I think the vision of Shinzo Abe has been very, very important factor in driving this conversation. And therefore, when you saw that, after the initial demise, so-called demise of Quad, you had the resurrection in 2017. It was again Japan was leading it. Japan was leading it. That let's revive this once again and see where we can go. So clearly, when you have initiatives like these, where there is a lot of contention, where there's a lot of debate, which are new, which are sort of changing the regional architecture, you need stable leadership with a very defined sense of conviction. And Abe was able to provide that. Now, what Mr. Abe has also been able to do gradually, as I was saying earlier, is increasing consensus within his own party as well as in Japan about the need for it, primarily because of what China is doing and how Japan wants to, a section in Japan wants to revive Japan as a normal state, as a state which has, with a credible military force, which can also do some kind of power projection. So I think what we are going to see, I think very interestingly, some debate about this. I think as Mr. Abe pointed out in his own remarks during the resignation, that changing the constitution was, was one area where he could not succeed. And there is a lot of debate within Japan about it, how far Japan wants to go. But clearly he has been able to push Japan into articulating a security vision for Japan, which is quite distinct from what, from pre-Abe era. So you can almost divide Japanese security policy into pre-Abe and post-Abe. And I think now you had even, I think last week before his resignation, his foreign minister was talking about, Abe's foreign minister was talking about how Japan might join Five Eyes intelligence network, with the Western countries. And so clearly you have a shift there in terms of the perspective of Japanese policymakers. And therefore, my sense is that, again, I think Ambassador Prakash pointed it out as well, that Quad will continue, the emphasis on Quad will continue. The structural realities are such that all the 4 nations will have to invest in something like this. If not Quad, then something like this will have to come up, because regional security architecture needs something like this. And it can probably become a nucleus for something bigger, something more ambitious. And as you were pointing out, there are already discussions, at least from Washington, what to do about it, whether to formalize it into more NATO-like alliance, which seems to be a bit far-fetched at the moment. But clearly, I think all 4 countries today are thinking seriously about what to do with Quad in a manner that is not simply superfluous. That is something more substantive. And I think that's where initially Mr. Abe would be missed, but I am sure his successor would be equally invested in the project.
Absolutely. Ambassador, you heard both the professors out. As far as policies are concerned, we've seen this, and history has told us that whenever there is someone new that comes in, there is likely to be some kind of a policy change. But the Japanese media and the international media is all reporting that Suga will probably continue on the path of Abe's policies, because he has been closely associated and related with it. Do you see that happening? That is one. And talking about India, I'm going to go back to the point that Professor Kondapalli was making about the sluggish pace of some of the projects that that Japan is undertaking in India. This has always been a problem as far as our partnerships and projects with other nations are concerned as well.
Well, absolutely. I more than broadly agree with both my co-panelists about their take on the subject. Now, let me dwell a little more on the candidature of Mr. Suga. As was mentioned by one of my co-panelists, Japan had LDP had 2 choices: either to have a broader vote of 1.09 million members of LDP, or a more compact one, and LDP has 394 MPs. So the college will comprise of 535 ballots, which will be 394 MPs and 3 representatives each from 47 prefectures. So 535 ballots will choose the new leader. And that is where Suga-san has an edge for a variety of reasons. One, the faction that he belongs to, which was traditionally known as the Hosoda faction, is the largest with 98 members. As of today, and in Japan, everything can change within the matter of minutes, but as of today, it is believed that the second largest faction of Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso, which has 54 members, is supporting Suga-san. And also the Nikkei faction with 47 members are supporting Suga-san. So as of the moment, it seems that it is a signed and sealed deal. What happens tomorrow, one does not know. Now, Suga-san has the ability of continuity. He has been a loyal ally, supporter of Prime Minister Abe. So his stewardship will spell continuity. And that is something that is required, because now I need to mention here that there will be 2 choices for Suga-san: either to be an Abe light, because he is stepping into big shoes, or call for a snap poll. And there is a growing feeling in Japan that should Suga-san get a bump in his ratings, which normally happens when a new incumbent comes in, he may go in for a snap poll to be not just a de jure leader, but a de facto leader. So that is as far as the Japanese internal politics is concerned. Now, coming to a very valid point that you may raise about implementation. Unfortunately, given our system, which is so complicated, we do face implementation blues, not only for projects within our country, but also for the infrastructure projects, developmental assistance projects that we do for other countries. Fortunately, the present government is very conscious of this fact, and a lot of effort is being made. We need to step on the gas pedal. And, because while comparisons are odious, willy-nilly there is a comparison with another country. And it's not that we have not been able to do that. Delhi Metro project is, for example, a shining example. And we need the style of implementation of Delhi Metro projects.
Right. Okay. Professor Kondapalli, what's the best way forward then?
I think we need to wait for the new leader to settle down in his job. There were some setbacks in the previous times. For example, Shinzo Abe's policies in regard to Russia, in regard to China, in regard to North Korea. I think there is a lot that needs to be done in this regard. The LDP has sent its most senior leader to the Belt and Road Initiative project twice in the 2 summit meetings. They find the China equation to be difficult, but they depend on this because over 80,000 Japanese companies are functioning in China as compared to just about 1,300 companies in India. So they do find still sustenance in terms of the Chinese economy. And this is where the India also need to work on a long-term basis in order to attract the Japanese companies. Of course, Shinzo Abe had announced the shift from China, and he has also provided some subsidies as well for the companies to shift. But many of these companies are going to Vietnam, Indonesia, and other areas. So I think we need to make more concerted effort in attracting these companies. If not 80,000 companies, at least a portion of them, we need to attract them. And of course, the Uttar Pradesh government has laid down a few plans in this regard. So I think it is connected to the Japanese overall policy and how we receive in India.
Absolutely. And Professor Pant, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think, Frank, Japan has emerged as a very, very important partner for India over the last few years, and Mr. Abe's role, I think, cannot be underestimated. He has to be looked at as one of the tallest Japanese leaders in recent years, and his contribution not only to bilateral ties with India, but I think shaping the larger regional frameworks and larger regional narrative is going to be, it has been very, very important. He'll be sorely missed just in terms of articulating this regional architecture during a very, very difficult time. But I think as we move forward, my hunch is that we are likely to see more of the same. There can be some initial delay in terms of approaching certain issues and certain questions. But again, the trajectory that has been set by Mr. Abe and by successive Indian governments in the last 2 decades will continue, because the structural realities in the region are such that India and Japan will have to be partners, and to be, if you look at it squarely, there are no fundamental differences between the 2 countries. So as we look at a partnership that is not simply bilateral, but also regional, that is also multilateral, I think this is a partnership that is only going to grow in the coming years. And as I think Japanese politicians have been saying, that this is a partnership that is going to be one of the most important ones, both for India and Japan. This is something that where Mr. Abe has contributed significantly, and perhaps his successor would like to follow the same trajectory.
All right. Okay, on that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that over the last 20 years, Japan and India ties have moved from strength to strength. During the Abe era, the ties were taken to new heights. What has brought us together is economic factor.